Conversation. I am not Mary Louise Kelly from NPR, although since she's on the radio, you may not have been immediately able to recognize that I'm not Mary Louise Kelly. We've had some speaker changes this morning. The congresswoman who was supposed to be joining us was stuck in Washington last night for votes and didn't actually make it out here. So I'm Garrett Graff. I'm my day job here is as the director of the Aspen Cybersecurity and Technology Program, but my background is as a journalist covering federal law enforcement, and where I covered CBP and the Border Patrol for 2 years. And so I'm really excited to talk to Julian this morning, someone who I have followed for a long time on Twitter with his excellent writing at the Texas Tribune. And you too can follow him. Is it Nacho?
Yeah, at Nacho Aguilar. Nacho's my middle name. It's not because I have an affinity for horrible Tex-Mex or anything.
Julian, I thought maybe we could sort of start off just asking you to sort of talk about your own family experience at the border to sort of help anchor us with the region that we're going to be talking about for the next 50 minutes and give us sort of some picture of how this became an issue that is so central to your work.
Sure, yeah. Again, thank you all very much for having me this morning. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. My mom was born in Juarez, Ciudad Juarez. My dad was born in Chihuahua. So, you know, I'm first generation U.S.-born American citizen, but all my family has been living in the United States, most of them for a really long time. And I don't know if anybody has been to El Paso, but it's one of those towns where, I mean, it's very unique. You know, from my home office, if I drive down the block and I turn left, in 5 minutes I'll be at Fort Bliss. If I turn right, in 5 minutes I'll be in Ciudad Juarez. You know, you can hear the 21 gun salute on Memorial Day just as clear as you can hear the festival music whenever Ciudad Juarez has its annual expo. You know, my mom was a customs agent and she was in law enforcement before it was DHS. It was still Department of Treasury. My dad was a school teacher. I've had plenty of family members that were, you know, Border Patrol sector, CBP, and I think that's just the way El Paso is. And I also have a lot of friends and family that may have, you know, been on the other side of this sort of line of law enforcement. You might have gotten into trouble, but it's just the dynamics of the border. At least the Texas border, it's still pretty solidly blue, maybe purple, because the Democrats down there, they're a little bit more, I guess, socially conservative, but they still usher in, you know, Congresswoman Escobar, she was the former county judge, and now she's the representative out there. She succeeded former Congressman O'Rourke, and they usually don't have any problems in the general election. That's just the way El Paso and the rest of the border is. But, you know, just growing up, being a reporter, my first full-time stint was in Laredo, Texas. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Laredo, Texas, but that was, you know, a really, really small border town. And then after NAFTA, it exploded. The Port of Laredo is consistently the #1 inland port in the United States, and now it's actually the #1 overall port. It surpassed LA a few months back because of the trade wars that we're having with China. So that's also, I think, an important component that folks might overlook with respect to everything that's in the news right now as far as legitimate trade and travel. You know, Border Patrol is everywhere in El Paso. A lot of the border Democrats, you know, at the state level, they don't like the idea of sending National Guard troops or more DPS because they don't like what they say is the militarization of the border. But again, from my house in Central El Paso, I can see DPS, I can see El Paso Police Department, I can see CBP helicopters, I can see Border Patrol helicopters. And I just want to say that I don't ever feel unsafe in my hometown. I never felt not safe in Laredo. I go to Ciudad Juarez often for work. It's a little dodgier there, you know, depending on what I'm doing and who I'm talking to. But there is, obviously everybody's been keeping up with the news for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, there is just a mass number of people coming over. Most of them are seeking asylum. But with respect to, you know, something, you know, in the World War Z movie where you see people just like scaling the fences and coming this mob, it's not like that at all. At least not from where I'm sitting and, you know, what I'm reported for the last 12 years.
Yeah. So you finished there on this sort of asylum migrant crisis. And that's obviously, you know, part of the oddity of the Ideas Festival is we pick these topics in January, right, and sort of try to do our best guess of figuring out what's actually going to be relevant 6 months later. And this week we've seen, you know, some of the most horrific stories coming out of asylum crisis from the Northern Triangle countries of the last couple of years. And I'm curious if you could sort of give us a sense of how you've seen this crisis unfold for the last couple of years, and sort of what has brought us to where we are right now.
It's, to give you the Cliff's Notes version, it started in 2014. We discussed this backstage when this was when the crush of unaccompanied minors were coming to the United States. And the Rio Grande Valley, which I think roughly starts in Roma, the sector, Rio Grande Valley sector, the Border Patrol starts in Roma, and it goes all the way down to Brownsville. That was the hot spot in 2014. That's when a lot of these kids were coming. But in 2014, that's what it was. It was a lot of unaccompanied minors. Now we're seeing a shift to family units. And the family units in 2014, there were a lot of them, but they were mainly mothers with their young children. And now we're seeing mixed families, which includes dads and moms with their young children. So that's, to me, I think that's the biggest change. These are, it's not uncommon. I'm sure everybody is familiar with the photograph that ran. There's a lot of controversy about whether folks should have run that photograph or not with the father and his little girl. And this was in Matamoros on the other side of Brownsville. But in El Paso alone, just so far this year, there have been 9 bodies pulled from the canals. There was 4 bodies, I think, found in the McAllen sector near Anzalduas Park that the sheriff down there, at El Rincón de Diablo is the Devil's Corner because it's so hot, and this is where they find a lot of these folks. So this has been happening. It's always been happening. There are always folks that succumb to the heat and the elements. But what's different now is that there are now a lot more families, and you ask what's kind of fueling this, and I think in part it's due to the president's sort of trying to do what he can to close the border. I mean, the smugglers are not dumb people, and they're not compassionate people. Their bottom line is the dollar, and so they are able to communicate this message, saying, look, if you're going to go, you better go now because the president's going to do X, Y, Z. You got to, so that's why there's been this rush of people. We also have, and I don't think the president realized, campaign mode to presidential mode, how difficult it was going to be to stop some of these laws in their tracks. I mean, there are certain lawsuits that have halted a lot of what he's trying to do. But meanwhile, while those are sort of percolating in the district court level, I think the word is still getting out to that people need to come up. There's been a lot of policies that have tried to deter these folks. The most recent, Remain in Mexico, it's the general term for the Migration Protection Protocol. But so it's this sort of combination of all these factors that are pushing these people up north. And we could spend 3 days talking about the U.S. intervention in Central America and what's causing the civil wars that began, and the fact that President Bill Clinton passed what are called the 3- and 10-year bars, which exploded the immigration problem in the United States, and the fact that his administration deported what was then a little-known gang called MS-13 that exploded in El Salvador, which is also fueling people to come up here. Climate conditions in Guatemala. Honduras is still violent. Mexico is trying to get itself together, but it's the states like Guerrero are still some of the most violent. So it's a combination of propaganda, I think, of the fact that maybe some of these people that are still in Central America have talked to people that have made it and say, yeah, I crossed between the ports, I got an ankle monitor, I got a notice to appear, but that's not for years, so it's a lot safer here than it was. And the president's policies. Yeah,
let's spend a minute talking about the Remain in Mexico policy, because I think that is one of the most interesting aspects of this. And as background, these refugees coming from the Northern Triangle countries are coming to the United States to apply for asylum, which they have the legal right to do under international treaties that the U.S. has long supported and long agreed to, and they are not technically committing a crime by coming to the United States to apply for asylum.
Sure.
And one of the things that the Trump administration has tried to do is push this Remain in Mexico program, which sort of throttles the number of people who can arrive at the border and apply for asylum per day,
right,
and forces them to remain in Mexico, as the policy name states. But it seems like that is not proving particularly effective, and in some cases sort of increasing the desperation of some of these refugees to get across the border in the first place. And then you had this sort of stunning legal maneuver this week where you actually had U.S. asylum officers file a brief in a lawsuit arguing against the administration's policy, saying it was making their jobs harder. It's not consistent with international law, and actually putting the asylum officers at physical risk to their own safety.
Right.
So I'm curious, from the border perspective. What do you make of the Remain in Mexico policy? Sort of, what, if any, impact have you seen that play out?
I think eventually it is going to make some impact, and I say this because when it started in San Isidro, the port in California, and there was a slow rollout, and then it was expanded to the El Paso ports of entry, and this was expanded in late March. In early April, you started seeing folks that had been returned, and I say it's the word is going to get out because in early April I was at the immigration offices in Ciudad Juarez, and there was a family. She was it was a married couple. She was, I think, 6 months pregnant, and she had no idea about this policy. And I was the one that told her, and I said, "You realize that when your number is called to ask for asylum, they're going to send you back here, right?" And she looked at me like I killed her favorite pet cat or something, I mean, it was heartbreaking. And then so they go away and they're talking in the corner, and I turn around and 5 minutes later she's just bawling. So a lot of people didn't really know. And I talked to another family from Honduras that had waited in Ciudad Juarez to seek asylum. They sought asylum the previous day, and then they were sent back immediately. And I followed up with them about a week later, and they told me, they're like, "We waited, we did it." A lot of people say, well, if you're going to seek asylum, do it legally, right? Do it at the ports of entry. What the Trump administration did before Remain in Mexico is a process called metering, where they have CBP agents right at the U.S. border line at the top of the bridges, sending people back, saying, "We don't have room to process you right now. Go wait in Mexico." And sometimes the CBP agents, they do let them back in when they come back in. That was at the onset. Now the numbers have just exploded to where you're getting people to wait 2 or 3 months before they even apply for asylum, and then they're sent back into Mexico. This one family that I caught up with, they said, "We did it the right way. We sought asylum, and now we're sent back, and now we're going to have to wait here, a month and a half until our first immigration hearing." We were traveling in a small caravan with some cousins, and they crossed in between the ports. They jumped the river, and they're already in California. So at first it was just really chaotic. I sat in some of the first immigration hearings for the Remain in Mexico program, and even the immigration judge, I think he tried to say it under his breath, but he said into the mic after everything was said and done. He said, "Wow," I mean, that's all he said. And you had friends of court for that were advocating for the immigrants, telling the DHS attorneys like what the process was. I mean, it was really just sort of a rushed process. But now, we last reported on Remain in Mexico in May, and the numbers are about 2,200 people waiting in Ciudad Juarez alone. That number has climbed to 6,200 now.
Wow.
And the effect that this is going to have is that it's already affecting the shelter spaces in Juarez. They're run by the diocese there. They have some nonprofits. A lot of the churches, and I should give credit to the folks on the U.S. side too, because a lot of these shelters are run by nonprofits, NGOs, the Catholic diocese. But these folks in Ciudad Juarez, they're really, really concerned because Ciudad Juarez, there's an uptick in violence now. I think May closed out with homicide numbers that rivaled the tail end of what people refer to as the cartel war there that ran from 2008 to 2011. That's separate, but with a lot of this lawlessness comes sort of this vigilante type of government, into where these people don't have anything. They start preying on these Central Americans, and they're easy prey. And it's not just people from Central America, I should say. I don't know if you guys have been following the latest reports. I've spoken with people from Russia, from Uganda, from Cameroon, from the Congo. There's I think 8,000 folks from Cuba that have arrived over the last 6 months. So this is a phenomenon that's coming from all over the world. The numbers of South Americans are increasing as well.
Yep. And I think I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that nonprofit infrastructure.
Sure.
Because it is really striking when you're down at the border reporting on these issues, how many sort of failures of U.S. government you can see in the course of a single day. The Border Patrol, which has grown so dramatically since 9/11, remains truly overwhelmed and is sort of ill-equipped in many ways to handle this. It's a force that has been recruited and built and equipped basically to do war with drug cartels. and on a daily basis instead finds itself, accepting these children in family units who are willingly turning themselves over to the Border Patrol. You have these reports out of the Clint, Texas, and the infants and children sort of stuck in these overcrowded shelters, needing medical attention that the Border Patrol is either not willing or not able to provide. And then once they're processed, I've been down to the bus station in McAllen, Texas, right, where you have the sort of once the migrants are processed, the Border Patrol sort of just dumps them off at the bus station with a one-way bus ticket, right, and no food and no clothing. And sort of it's up to the nonprofits in these communities to sort of step up.
Right. So, and you're exactly right. The Border Patrol has been saying since this began in 2014, like, look, we're not equipped to handle this type of sort of exodus from these other countries. They've been saying, I mean, they said this as recently as last week when this news hit about the conditions in this facility in Clint, Texas, that they, the cells, the processing centers, were built and designed for the phenomena that we saw in the 80s and 90s. Single adult males coming to work and getting caught and getting processed and getting turned. They're not equipped to handle these facilities. So in Border Patrol's defense, they've been saying this for a really, really long time. And I think maybe now, perhaps with what was passed yesterday with the supplemental, maybe we'll start seeing a change. But you're right. I mean, the process that I've seen in El Paso over the last few years is that they are apprehended by Border Patrol. And I say apprehended because that's the government's term. Yep. When the May figures came out, they say that there were 144,000 apprehensions on the southern border. Again, a lot of these people are turning themselves in. They're not running and being apprehended. They're sort of surrendering. But once they are processed by Border Patrol, they get turned over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And what they're supposed to do with the family units in the minor children is they're supposed to turn them over either to a sponsor or to a shelter run by HHS, or if they can, to a nonprofit facility. So, for example, the Annunciation House in El Paso, Texas, that's one of the main shelter networks. And this was a few months ago where the director said over the last 3 or 4 months they've had to spend $1 million on hotel space. And when they have to have hotel space, that's because all the shelters in the networks are full. So that puts a strain. But I mean, it really is the community sort of going above and beyond. And you talk about Border Patrol now having to do these jobs. It's affecting every facet of immigration and trade, because what happened in late March was they started pulling CBP agents off the ports of entry. CBP are the men and women in blue at the ports that process people, legitimate trade and travel is what they call it. So they had to pull some of those folks off to help Border Patrol process a lot of these families. So what that did is it slowed down legitimate trade and travel, which hurts everybody's pocketbook, especially on the border. So it's a problem that's affecting everything. It's not just a security issue. And Democrats were reluctant to say it's a crisis. If it was a crisis, it was a humanitarian crisis, whereas Republicans were saying it's a security and humanitarian crisis. I mean, you could play a drinking game with the word crisis and we'd be buzzed by noon or something like that, because they say it so often. But it's just like the definition of what type of crisis it is. So I think now everybody's on board saying, okay, we really, really, really need to do something. And we'll see how this plays out. There was a lot of concern from some of the more progressive House members on the vote yesterday about there's not enough sort of guards on what CBP, what DHS can do with this allocation of money. They fear that it's going to be used for enforcement. So we're going to wait and see how that plays out. But this is going to be something we're going to be talking about for a long, long time.
Yeah. I want to get sort of 2 more issues on the table before we open it up to questions, and then we can sort of start going in whatever the direction the audience wants to take us. Coming back to sort of this question of the Border Patrol, sure. There is no single policy, more identified with President Trump than this idea of the wall.
Right.
And that this was, in many ways, the animating force of his presidential campaign. It was his trip to the border in the summer of 2015, where he actually sort of first deployed his Make America Great Again hat. Mm-hmm. And that the Border Patrol was really one of his first backers. The Border Patrol Union and then later the ICE Union were the first 2 unions to endorse him. And that we've sort of heard all of these promises about building the wall, tripling the size of the Border Patrol. and I'm curious from your standpoint, living down there. I mean, just what a crazy idea is the wall?
It, you know, it does depend on who you speak to. So, for example, I cover even rural West Texas, and we actually have a small family farm in Hudspeth County, which is not on the banks of the river, but it's the property behind it that's on the banks of the river. I talk to those folks, and they say, yeah, we could use some fencing here. We really could, because this is a phenomenon, and it changes. The Texas-Mexico border is 1,254 miles. It's very different from El Paso to Brownsville. Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Democrat from Laredo, he was very, very successful under the Obama administrations and even under the Bush administration about not having any barrier built in Webb County, because there the river, it's an actual river. I mean, it's wide and it flows and it's raging. He said that we have a natural barrier. In parts of El Paso, it's a makeshift concrete channel where you can skip across it. So in certain areas, it does kind of depend on who you talk to. But I think largely a lot of people are against it. There's been fencing in Texas since the Bush administration. So, for example, we did a project called The Taking that talked about eminent domain land seizures down in the Rio Grande Valley. And we concentrated in Cameron County on this 4-mile strip of land called Oklahoma Avenue. And the folks down there, their land was seized, and they had a fence running through what used to be their backyard, and it would run for a half mile, and all of a sudden there were these gaps. Not with the fence, just like a gap. And they're like, well, what good is this? I mean, it's like, and yeah, some of them had gates and some of them had codes or whatever. But we have to realize that some of these barriers were actually a half a mile north of the Rio Grande. So which they said renders all the land behind them useless. I mean, I don't know every other state, but in Texas we're pretty proud of our private property and our big ranches and our pickup trucks and whatnot. So this was sort of a blow, especially to see that it didn't really have the effect that it was purported to have. And now in El Paso, you're still seeing people come over. What they started doing in El Paso sector, at least, is they've started improving the existing fence, and they've started putting like a 5-foot steel plate up on top that they say is slip resistant. But we see that it really hasn't slowed the problem, again, because you cannot build the barrier in the middle of the river. There are treaties, there are agencies that will not let you do that. Mexico would not be on board with that. So it has to be on the north side, it has to be on the U.S. side. And all people that want to seek asylum have to do is cross that international boundary. So you can be south of the fence and north of the Rio Grande, and Border Patrol will come get you. So I mean, it's not an effective solution at all. And again, I think in similar fashion to the president's sort of maybe he wasn't aware about how easy it was going to be to tweak these asylum laws. I think that it was the same thing with these fencings, because there's been lawsuits that have stopped them. And I think most of what he's been able to do has been on federal land, where you don't have to seize any of this private land, and where DHS can apply these waivers to circumvent these environmental regulations. So, I mean, I think if Trump supporters thought in 2019, where we are, that there would be hundreds and hundreds of more fencing built, I'm sure they're disappointing. So, but the flip side of the coin is that there was a private group that raised $22 million through a GoFundMe account, and part of the leadership was Chris Kobach and certain folks that are very pro-Trump, and they actually built about a half mile of barrier on private land in Sunland Park, New Mexico. So it's just,
just like 2 or 3 weekends ago, right?
Yeah, it was Memorial Day. I mean, they broke ground on Memorial Day, and they had some of it completed. Now, post that, there was a lot of back and forth on whether they got the necessary permits, and whether the International Boundary and Water Commission was hip to what they were doing, or there was pushback. But that just kind of goes to show sort of the complexity of the issue. This private group through GoFundMe did what the federal government has largely been unable to do.
Yeah. So last topic I wanted to get on the table here is sort of the Mexican tariff war. Sure. That we've been seeing, where the president has been threatening Mexico with huge tariffs and escalating tariffs if it doesn't do more to secure its southern border, right, really, and sort of stop these migrants in the first place. And I'm curious, what is the borderland perspective on the tariffs, and what would the actual impact on the United States be of those?
I think it was a united front completely against these tariffs, with one exception. Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick has said, yeah, it'll be bad for the economy, but we need to do something. And on that note, I just want to get one last thing in about the fence. When President Trump had his rally in El Paso in February, the Lieutenant Governor was on Fox News, and he said, if the border fence wasn't here, you would have heads rolling down the street the way you do in Mexico. That's not the perspective of 99.9% of the people that live on the border, whether they're Republican or Democrat. But it's just, kind of goes to show that he was the lone supporter of this tariff war because, so I mentioned earlier that the Port Laredo surpassed the Port of LA as the #1 inland port. Just through April, there was $203 billion in two-way trade between the U.S. and Mexico. That's billion with a B. The #1 and 2 ports for that are Laredo and El Paso. And I think what a lot of folks may not have realized or maybe realized later after they sort of read the Chamber of Commerce statements is that Texas would have been the hardest hit with these tariffs, that would have begun at 5% and then it increased to 25% over time. But then after that, it would have been Michigan, and then California, and then we'll go to Illinois, and then Ohio. So they round out the top 5. And what people have to realize is that, trade with China, what we import from China is largely already assembled. Trade with Mexico, things go back and forth on the assembly line several times. So you're hurting the American worker, too, by imposing these tariffs. And then what would Mexico do in retribution? And just the international relations, it's just the Mexican-American cities, it's, Porfirio Diaz's famous line, about Mexico being, so far from God, so close to the U.S. That shows the history of this tension that these two countries have had. So if you want to add to that, especially now, I think a lot of people were sort of emotionally just like charged with, this tariff war because the border is someplace that goes back and forth. As a reporter, when the president said he's going to close the border, just like flat out close it, I was getting some, people tweeting and emailing at me saying, why are you even covering this? He's not going to do it. He's not going to do it. I had a feeling he wasn't going to do it, but the fact that he even said it, it affected the Paso. It affected wait times at the bridge. It affected international students that, are U.S. citizens that are raised in Ciudad Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, that go to the United States for school. It affected everything across the board, just him saying this thing. So the tariff thing, I think finally, and then you had our U.S. Senators Ted Cruz and John Cornyn actually speak out against these tariffs, and they've been pretty lockstep with the president, up until this policy. So that was actually something that people were surprised about, pleasantly surprised, I should add. But again, if you're gonna hurt Mexico's economy, you're only going to increase the problems in Mexico, which it didn't really make any sense to why you're going to put the pressure on that country, and Mexico could retaliate the way we saw with the steel and aluminum tariffs, bourbon from Mitch McConnell's district and things like that. So,
yep.
Yeah.
All right, let's open it up to some questions here in just a minute. We have mics coming down, so please wait for the mic. We'll start right down here with the gentleman.
Hi, I just returned from Latin America. I've lived in Central America for the last 15 years, doing agricultural projects. What people are talking about these days up here is very harmful. I wonder if you've noticed, like during this Trump administration, I've been gone since the Bush administration, so it seems the rhetoric has gotten pretty horrible, pretty vile. Even meetings I've been at the last few days here, the way people talk about Central Americans and Mexicans, it's really disheartening. Do you feel the increase in a personal level? Like I've had friends in Oregon be told to go home. They're third generation Oregonians. So have you felt the increase in like the permission to be loud and proud about racist talk? Have you felt that? I have, just being here 3 weeks.
Personally, I'm in a. It's my job to do what I do. I try not to look at comments on stories just because, you'll go home and rock yourself in a corner and cry all day if you really take these to heart. But no, the rhetoric has amped up, I think. It really, really has. For example, in the end of the 2017 session in Texas, at the Texas legislature, when they passed Senate Bill 4, which was, one of the anti-sanctuary city provisions, it was pretty sweeping. You had lawmakers almost getting to blows on the floor the last day of the session because of that. You had protesters in the gallery, against SB 4, and a lot of people were saying, well, we'll just call ICE on those people. A lot of those people are U.S. citizens. You can't call ICE on U.S. citizens just because they're brown people doesn't mean that they're like that. But I think it's maybe it was always out there. I think that there's a lot of folks that maybe that's the way they really felt, and this administration has maybe let them sort of come out of the closet, so to speak. But I have noticed it on, but that's also, but social media has also played a large role in that with, news reports that you don't know if they're real or not. I've gotten into conversations with friends of mine that read a headline in the lead in the nut graph of a story, and that's all there is to it. And I say, well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So a short answer is yes, but how extreme it is, I don't, maybe I'm just sensitive to it, or maybe because I live on the border, I'm a little bit more sheltered from it, but I think overall, I think you have a point, yes, sir.
And then I think there's a woman on the side over here too.
Yes, we heard Julian Castro talk about Section 1325 and the Democratic candidates talking about decriminalizing, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate on that. I'm not familiar with that section.
Well, 1325 is part of the United States Code, correct? That makes it a federal crime to enter the country illegally. I think, when we're in campaign season, I think if just my guess, seeing what's happened with the Trump administration, if he did put forth a policy to end that or an executive order, it would likely be challenged in the courts, would it not? I mean, if you want to speak to that, you covered the administration as well. So, I mean, 1325 USC is the broad law that has all the facets of, criminalizing illegal crossings, and that goes hand in hand with the zero tolerance policy.
Yep.
And I should say that a lot of people that email me, they say, well, President Obama also separated families, which was true, but they separated families at a much smaller scale, and that was when a child came across and they thought the child was in danger or the child wasn't with a parent or guardian as purported to be. It was not part of this zero tolerance policy where everybody was prosecuted, and that's under 1325. So it's just a sweeping measure that encompasses a lot of the federal immigration provisions.
Yeah, just to sort of clarify this, because we've sort of alluded to this without making this explicit. So under international law, under international treaty, if you are seeking asylum to the United States, you can do so at an official port of entry without committing a crime. That's if you sort of walk up to one of the blue uniformed CBP officers and ask for asylum. We are legally obligated to give it to you, or at least start the process to see if you qualify for it, and there's no crime committed. If you cross outside of a legal port of entry, then you come up against the green uniforms of the Border Patrol, who are responsible for the space in between the legal ports of entry. And at that moment, you have committed a federal crime by crossing the border illegally. Where this gets complicated is, as Julian was saying, that most of these asylum seekers are not are crossing in between those ports of entry and interacting with the Border Patrol, therefore committing a crime, but also not necessarily attempting to elude. I've been down in the Rio Grande Valley, and been out on patrol with the Border Patrol, and these migrants would have surrendered to me as a white guy in khakis on the border, and that this is, and that in fact these crossings are often driven by the cartels who control a lot of the border crossing. The part of the cartel's strategy is if you take these groups of asylum seekers and throw them across the border in between the ports of entry, that ties up the Border Patrol resources such that it makes it easier for the cartel to get the drugs across that they're trying to smuggle separately. If you put a group of 100 Northern Triangle country migrants out at the beginning of a Border Patrol shift in the Rio Grande Valley, you've tied up most of the Border Patrol resources, in a 3 to 5 mile swath of the border. So where Julian Castro and I think sort of some of the Democrats are now pushing is, this idea of decriminalizing the act of crossing in between a border port of entry. If sort of you're not doing anything else, it would still be illegal if you were trying to smuggle drugs across or smuggle guns across or money back and forth. But that if your only act is to get across the border in between a port of entry, that shouldn't necessarily be something that then qualifies you as committing a federal crime. Is that a relatively accurate summary?
No, that's how I understand it. And then a lot of people are criticizing this metering process because, why, like the family that I mentioned earlier, why, if you are going to wait 2 months to do it legally, but yet your cousin just jumped the river and is already in LA with a notice to appear years down the road, why would you even wait? Why would you do that? So yeah, that's exactly what what I think the candidates are saying. And with respect to sort of these decoys, I mean, the smugglers do it with everybody. I've covered stories in Eagle Pass where they use teenagers to cross 50 pounds of pot over here, so everybody swarms over here. Meanwhile, half a mile down the road, you have hundreds and hundreds of loads going through. So,
woman over here.
Thank you. I'm curious about, you were talking about the families coming over and over the past couple years, and I guess this past year with the children being separated. Have they all been reunited with the families? What's been going on with the children that were separated?
that's been very, very chaotic. I mean, the short answer is no. I'm not clear how many of those children have yet to be reunited, but when that separation policy took place, you heard stories about parents that were deported while their children were still in the United States. I mean, there have been court orders, giving the government deadlines to reunite these families, and the government has actually admitted this, that we don't know where a lot of these people are. So I think the number of separated children is still in the hundreds, but we're seeing this again. The Houston Chronicle had an excellent report just recently on how the Trump administration is using not the zero tolerance policy, but this policy that I described, where they say that the child is in danger, or they don't believe that the parent or guardian is actually the parent or guardian of that child. So they're using that to sort of separate more families. And a lot of these folks in the Clinton facility, they called them unaccompanied minors, but they were only unaccompanied minors at that time because they had been separated by a legal parent or guardian once that. But after the initial wave that began last summer, I think there are still a few hundred that have yet to be reunited for myriad reasons, mainly that they don't know where the parents are, and maybe they have been deported already.
Yeah, I think the last number that I saw was somewhere around 600 that the U.S. government believes it will never be able to reunite with their parents. So, down here.
Yes.
Yep.
My name is Arturo Thompson. I live in southeast Arizona with a cattle ranch 6 miles from the Mexican border. Except for this family problem, I think that the border crisis was totally contrived for political reasons. And in fact, it's not a crisis. Now it is perhaps with families, but the traditional working men coming across was not a crisis. I think it's totally hypocritical, political. That was totally done for political purposes. 2 questions. Why not get the guest worker program going like yesterday, which will take the pressure off the American farmers that need people who will actually work? Americans don't work in the fields anymore, with rare exceptions. Number 1. And number 2, this may shock people or not, let's legalize drugs, because people are getting drugs anyway. We could wipe out all the cartels overnight if we legalize drugs. I'm opposed to drugs. I have no interest in marijuana. Well, it's kind of a joke, smuggling pot over when you can get pot right here in Colorado. This is insanity. But if we legalize drugs, in the equation of the evil of drugs, we have to take into consideration the evil of the cartels. And I think Portugal legalized drugs, essentially, and I don't think they have a big crisis there. So those are 2 things, legalization of drugs and Bracero or guest worker program. Thank you.
On the guest worker program, I think that's been debated, and it's if you could come up with a solution that actually works, I nominate you to be the next coach of the Dallas Cowboys, and we'll win Super Bowls for years and years and years ahead. But there have been measures and proposals and bills to introduce, as there have been decriminalization and legalization. I just think you have pushback from a lot of groups that these are, I think. And I'm just speaking from a Texas legislative perspective. I think a lot of bills get filed so people can go back to their district and say, hey, I tried, blame it on this party or this committee. With respect to a federal guest worker program, I haven't seen any movement on anything moving through Congress. And I think just because we're not there yet. The same thing with decriminalization efforts or even legalization efforts, ending the prohibition on even pot. Again, speaking from a Texas perspective, there was a bill to not make marijuana, less than 2 ounce of possession of marijuana, not make it legal, but make it, akin to a speeding ticket. That passed the House and, it didn't pass the Senate. I just think there's so much pushback on both sides. And, to be fair, there are also labor groups that push back against a guest worker program because they criticize what they say would be the inhumane treatment of these workers that would qualify of the, sort of the wages. And I think you also have a lot of pushback from unions that say, you're going to have a guest worker program, you're going to pay somebody $8 an hour when I was getting paid $12 an hour. So there's a lot of pushback from all sort of circles. I mean, that's just...
It's voluntary. They're coming here voluntarily to work.
Sure, no, I understand. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, again, family members that I have in Border Patrol, they would, sort of turn the other way when the farmer in Presidio needed 12 people to come across, and then they'd go back 8 hours later, they would get their crops picked, the Mexicans would get paid, and then he would deport them or have them voluntarily return so he'd fill out his stat sheet. It was a much more simple time, but that was like the de facto guest worker program. To get something actually codified at a federal level, I think, I hate to be so negative or cynical about it, but I think we're years and years away, especially under the current administration.
Yeah, well, and sort of along the point of sort of the contrivedness of this as a crisis, one of the really interesting trends over the last decade has been we've actually seen net negative migration from Mexico. Sure. That because of sort of these farm worker programs over the years, because of actually the strengthening Mexican economy, that we have actually seen more Mexicans leaving the United States than we have seen Mexicans migrating to the United States. And so most of this crisis is what in government parlance is called the OTMs, the other than Mexicans crossing the border from the Northern Triangle countries, from Africa, and from Cuba, which has actually been sort of one of the weird trends, as you mentioned, of the President Trump cracking down on the relationship with Cuba has actually driven a lot of Cubans up to try to cross the border illegally from Mexico to try to get to the United States before the Cuban trade policies are changed.
Right, yeah, with respect to the Cubans, well, actually, one thing is that there have been recent reports that now there's actually 1 million U.S. citizens living in Mexico that are migrating that way. And a lot of the Mexican economy, they say it's getting better, so there's no need to leave. A lot of these immigration crackdowns, I'm sure, are fueling it. But one last thing with respect to the Cubans, before President Obama ended the wet foot, dry foot policy, we were seeing 20, 30,000 Cubans at the Texas ports, and now it's like you alluded to, it's the same sort of phenomenon. Like you better go now. And the Cubans that I've talked to in Juarez, Cuba still has one of the highest literacy rates in Latin America. These people are knowledgeable, they're very smart, they're getting very, very, very antsy about having to wait in Mexico, and now they're part of the Remain in Mexico program. So that's just throwing a little bit more fuel on this fire that I think is only going to grow.
Yeah. Let's see. Right there.
Two questions, not exactly directly related, but the first is recent reports of American citizens being arrested for providing humanitarian aid to people coming across the border for illegal assistance to these asylum seekers. And then the second is the president a week ago said he was going to begin rounding up millions of people in our country through ICE efforts, and he said he had hit a pause button because of requests from the Democrats for 2 weeks. So clock's ticking. How do you think that'll impact your area if he proceeds with any part of that?
I think we're gonna see the same fear, except at a greater level that we saw as soon as the president came into office, where you're going to get a lot of mixed status families, mixed status because some are here as U.S. citizens or with legal permission, some aren't. But you're going to see this fear factor again. You're going to see kids afraid to go to school because they're going to worry about when they come home if their parents are going to be there. Afraid to go to the hospital, to the doctor. I spoke with somebody yesterday that lived in Houston that said, under Trump and under SB4, they were afraid to go to a medical clinic, because of all these factors. But the president said he was going to put the pause button on that, and then people, rolled their eyes and said, oh, he said he was going to close the border. He's not going to do it. They have increased ICE enforcement procedures, at least in Texas. I mean, there were sweeps over the last week, even when he said he was not going to do this, to go after people with felony warrants, include in cities like Austin and Laredo and South and Central Texas. So if you do this on a massive scale, I don't think he's going to be able to do it in the thousands the way he said, because even when he announced it and you had federal officials expressing their dismay that the president announced this, saying, "Hey, heads up, we're coming for you." We're not really, I mean, I've never been in law enforcement, but I think that's counterproductive. I don't know if you all, disagree or not. But they said, not only is he giving them a heads up, but we don't have the resources to run with thousands and thousands of people. And with respect to the reports, I've read similar reports that this is happening mainly in the San Diego, Tijuana sector, where you had immigration lawyers that were not allowed to enter Mexico, though. I mean, I think that was sort of part of this sort of agreement with Mexico. And I should add that when the tariff threat was taken off the table, a lot of the president's critics said, well, Mexico's been doing this anyway, and he was not going to go through with it. It was just all smoke and mirrors. To be fair to the Mexican government, they had actually started the crackdown before. I was in Coahuila, which is across from Eagle Pass, in March when there was a small caravan, and the Mexican government did not let these people seek asylum. They kept them in Mexico. They made a former factory a makeshift warehouse, and they offered them work visas to remain in Mexico. So this sort of Mexico's cooperation preceded the tariff threat on a smaller scale, but Mexico was doing something. Now, where the president did get a victory, I think, is what we talked about, is the expansion of the Remain in Mexico program. When it was first announced, Mexico was against it, but they had to agree with it, and they said, well, we'll figure out what the courts decide. And a lot of the Mexican president's critics said it's not really good foreign policy to wait for a U.S. court to decide, on a policy that you're against. You should put forth your objection to it immediately and try to do what you can. So the president, I think, in my opinion, did get a victory in Mexico's agreement to expand this policy, because I've covered it and I see just how it's affecting the Mexican border towns.
Yeah, and just to add a little sort of federal policy context to it, nuance is not one of the president's policy strengths. And ICE, the number of people that ICE will deport in a given year is set in advance, and it is set by Congress, by the appropriations that ICE is given in order to sort of carry out its policy and its staffing and the number of beds that it actually has to hold people. And one of the most striking things has actually been the disconnect between the president's rhetoric and the actual execution of ICE, where ICE's deportation numbers are actually down pretty significantly from the Obama years. And Obama actually deported far more illegal immigrants in his first term than President Trump has been able to do by a matter of a couple 100,000 a year. Deportations under Obama, I think, peaked around 450,000 a year, and Trump is hitting about 225 a year, which sort of goes to show you how much of this is sort of the political backdrop of these things, because Obama was actually known as the deporter-in-chief during his tenure with immigration groups.
Right, and just to follow up on that, reporting on Obama's numbers, I remember that folks on the far right would criticize us, saying, "Oh, you guys are calling these deportations, they're voluntary removals. They're not really, they're not orders handed down." They got really, really technical on what we called it. And I was thinking, what do you care what the legal mechanism was? They're out of the country. That's what you wanted. And now we're seeing the opposite. It's like, oh, well, the president can't do this because the courts are tying his hands, or because whatever. So that just kind of speaks to your point on the rhetoric. Sort of it gets amped up.
Yeah, woman over here.
The concept of nation building seems to be something that's been lost to the ages, and I'm just curious, from your perspective on the border, what can we be doing outside of our borders that would address this situation in a more positive way?
It's a great question. It's also a tricky question, because I think a lot of people say we need to start sending more aid to Central America, and helping those countries. But then a lot of people are saying, well, what are we going to do with this money? Are we going to, is it going to go back to the sort of late 50s Che Guevara style, fighting United Fruit Company and things like that? One interesting thing, and I was in El Salvador in 2016 reporting on this story, and it's very odd that the head of the Policía Nacional Civil was a former guerrilla fighter that was fighting the U.S.-backed the U.S.-backed government then. I mean, it's weird. You see a statue to like the heroes of the revolution a block away from a Denny's and a Quiznos, right? So I just think that this, I think they do need to send more aid, and I think under the Merida initiative that was passed under President George W. Bush, there was money for Central America, but then there was also conditions on they had to address human rights abuse allegations before they got this money. They had to spend it in a certain way. So I think that's where we sort of get clogged up on what we can do in Latin America to help those people, feel safe and not flee. And again, this goes back to the deportation of the MS-13 gang, which was actually an American prison gang born in LA that exploded in Central America. But I think largely you want to see more people. I think largely people are on board with more aid to Central America. It just sort of the nuance of how they're going to be able to spend it and what the restrictions are, I think, is maybe what's a little bit controversial. I don't know if you agree with me or not.
Julian, I want to thank you for chatting with us this morning. We have to wrap up precisely on time because you are actually speaking on another session.
Right.
Across campus, but I want to give you 1 second to pitch your next session. So anyone who is sitting here being like, I really need more of this guy, what are you talking about next?
We're talking about the effects of having an angry neighbor, speaking about Mexico. And if you guys have any questions about Obama policy deportations, his former DHS secretary is on that panel. So.
Yep.